The Voyage of Life by Samuel Johnson, published in The Rambler, No. 102, March 9th, 1751. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2015. Life, says Seneca, is a voyage in the progress of which we are perpetually changing our scenes. We first leave childhood behind us, then youth, then the years of ripened manhood, then the better and more pleasing part of old age. The perusal of this passage having incited in me a train of reflections on the state of man, the incessant fluctuation of his wishes, the gradual change of his disposition to all external objects, and the thoughtlessness with which he floats along the stream of time, I sunk into a slumber amidst my meditations, and on a sudden found my ears filled with the tumult of labor, the shouts of alacrity, the shrieks of alarm, the whistle of winds, and the dash of waters. My astonishment for a time repressed my curiosity, but soon discovering myself so far as to inquire whither we were going, and what was the cause of such clamor and confusion, I was told that we were launching out into the ocean of life, that we had already passed the straits of infancy, in which multitudes had perished, some by the weakness and fragility of their vessels, and more by the folly, perverseness, or negligence of those who undertook to steer them, and that we were now on the main sea, abandoned to the winds and billows, without any other means of security than the care of the pilot, that it was always in our power to choose among great numbers that offered their direction and assistance. I then looked round with anxious eagerness, and first turning my eyes behind me, saw a stream flowing through flowery islands, which every one that sailed along seemed to behold with pleasure, but no sooner touched than the current, which, though not noisy or turbulent, was yet irresistible, bore him away. Beyond these islands all was darkness, nor could any of the passengers describe the shore at which he first embarked. Before me, and on each side, was an expanse of waters violently agitated, and covered with so thick a mist that the most perspicacious eye could see but a little way. It appeared to be full of rocks and whirlpools, for many sunk unexpectedly while they were courting the gale with full sails, and insulting those whom they had left behind. So numerous, indeed, were the dangers, and so thick the darkness, that no caution could confer security. Yet there were many who, by false intelligence, betrayed their followers into whirlpools, or by violence pushed those whom they found in their way against the rocks. The current was invariable and insurmountable, but though it was impossible to sail against it or to return to the place that was once passed, yet it was not so violent as to allow no opportunities for dexterity or courage, since, though none could retreat back from danger, yet they might often avoid it by oblique direction. It was, however, not very common to steer with much care or prudence, for by some universal infatuation every man appeared to think himself safe, though he saw his consorts every moment sinking around him, and no sooner had the waves closed over them than their fate and their misconduct were forgotten. The voyage was pursued with the same jocund confidence. Every man congratulated himself upon the soundness of his vessel, and believed himself able to stem the whirlpool in which his friend was swallowed, or glide over the rocks on which he was dashed, nor was it often observed that the sight of a wreck made any man change his course. If he turned aside for a moment, he soon forgot the rudder, and left himself again to the disposal of chance. This negligence did not proceed from indifference or from weariness of their present condition, for not one of those who thus rushed upon destruction failed, when he was sinking, to call loudly upon his associates for that help which could not now be given him, and many spent their last moments in cautioning others against the folly by which they were intercepted in the midst of their course. Their benevolence was sometimes praised, but their admonitions were unregarded. The vessels in which we had embarked, being confessedly unequal to the turbulence of the stream of life, were visibly impaired in the course of the voyage, so that every passenger was certain that how long soever he might by favorable accidents or by incessant vigilance be preserved, he must sink at last. This necessity of perishing might have been expected to sadden the gay and intimidate the daring, at least to keep the melancholy and timorous in perpetual torments, and hinder them from any enjoyment of the varieties and gratifications which nature offered them as the solace of their labors. Yet, in effect, none seem less to expect destruction than those to whom it was most dreadful. They all had the art of concealing their danger from themselves, and those who knew their inability to bear the sight of the terrors that embarrassed their way took care never to look forward, but found some amusement for the present moment, and generally entertained themselves by playing with Hope, who was the constant associate of the Voyage of Life. Yet all that Hope ventured to promise, even to those whom she favored most, was not that they should escape, but that they should sink last. And with this promise every one was satisfied, though he laughed at the rest for seeming to believe it. Hope, indeed, apparently mocked the credulity of her companions, for in proportion as their vessels grew leaky, she redoubled her assurances of safety, and none were more busy in making provisions for a long voyage than they whom all but themselves saw likely to perish soon by irreparable decay. In the midst of the current of life was the Gulf of Intemperance, a dreadful whirlpool interspersed with rocks, of which the pointed crags were concealed under water, and the tops covered with herbage, on which ease spread couches of repose, and with shades where pleasure warbled the song of invitation. Within sight of these rocks all who sailed on the ocean of life must necessarily pass. Reason, indeed, was always at hand to steer the passengers through a narrow outlet by which they might escape, but very few could, by her entreaties or remonstrances, be induced to put the rudder into her hand, without stipulating that she should approach so near unto the rocks of pleasure that they might solace themselves with a short enjoyment of that delicious region, after which they always determined to pursue their course without any other deviation. Reason was too often prevailed upon so far by these promises as to venture her charge within the eddy of the Gulf of Intemperance, where indeed the circumvolution was weak, but yet interrupted the course of the vessel and drew it, by insensible rotations, towards the center. She then repented her temerity, and with all her force endeavored to retreat, but the draught of the gulf was generally too strong to be overcome, and the passenger, having danced in circles with a pleasing and giddy velocity, was at last overwhelmed and lost. Those few whom reason was able to extricate generally suffered so many shocks upon the points which shot out from the rocks of pleasure that they were unable to continue their course with the same strength and facility as before, but floating along timorously and feeble, endangered by every breeze, and shattered by every ruffle of the water, till they sunk by slow degrees, after long struggles and innumerable expedients, always repining at their own folly, and warning others against the first approach of the Gulf of Intemperance. There were artists who professed to repair the breaches and stop the leaks of the vessels which had been shattered on the rocks of pleasure. Many appeared to have great confidence in their skill, and some indeed were preserved by it from sinking, who had received only a single blow. But I remarked that few vessels lasted long which had been much repaired, nor was it found that the artists themselves continued afloat longer than those who had least of their assistance. The only advantage which, in the Voyage of Life, the cautious had above the negligent was that they sunk later and more suddenly, for they passed forward till they had sometimes seen all those in whose company they had issued from the straits in infancy perish in the way, and at last were overset by a cross breeze, without the toil of resistance or the anguish of expectation. But such as had often fallen against the rocks of pleasure commonly subsided by sensible degrees, contended long with the encroaching waters, and harassed themselves by labors that scarce hope herself could flatter with success. As I was looking upon the various fate of the multitude about me, I was suddenly alarmed with an admonition from some unknown power. Gaze not idly upon others when thou thyself art sinking. Whence is this thoughtless tranquillity when thou and they are equally endangered? I looked, and seeing the gulf of intemperance before me, started and awaked. End of The Voyage of Life by Samuel Johnson.
The Sculptor's Funeral by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. A group of the townspeople stood on the station siding of a little Kansas town, awaiting the coming of the night train, which was already 20 minutes overdue. The snow had fallen thick over everything. In the pale starlight, the line of bluffs across the wide, white meadows south of town made soft, smoke-colored curves against the clear sky. The men on the siding stood first on one foot and then on the other, their hands thrust deep into their trouser pockets, their overcoats open, their shoulders screwed up with the cold, and they glanced from time to time toward the southeast, where the railroad track wound along the river shore. They conversed in low tones and moved about restlessly, seeming uncertain as to what was expected of them. There was but one of the company who looked as though he knew exactly why he was there, and he kept conspicuously apart, walking to the far end of the platform, returning to the station door, then pacing up the track again, his chin sunk in the high collar of his overcoat, his burly shoulders drooping forward, his gait heavy and dogged. Presently he was approached by a tall, spare, grizzled man, clad in a faded Grand Army suit, who shuffled out from the group and advanced with a certain deference, craning his neck forward until his back made the angle of a jackknife 3/4 open.
"I reckon she's going to be pretty late again tonight, Jim," he remarked in a squeaky falsetto. "S'pose it's a snow?"
"I don't know," responded the other man with a shade of annoyance, speaking from out an astonishing cataract of red beard that grew fiercely and thickly in all directions. The spare man shifted the quill toothpick he was chewing to the other side of his mouth.
"It ain't likely that anybody from the East'll come with the corpse, I s'pose," he went on reflectively.
"I don't know," responded the other, more curtly than before.
"It's too bad he didn't belong to some lodge or other. I like an order funeral myself. They seem more appropriate for people of some reputation," the spare man continued, with an ingratiating concession to his shrill voice, as he carefully placed his toothpick in his vest pocket. He always carried the flag at the GAR funerals in town. The heavy man turned on his heel without replying and walked up the siding. The spare man shuffled back to the uneasy group. "Jim's as full as a tick, as usual," he commented commiseratingly.
Just then a distant whistle sounded, and there was a shuffling of feet on the platform. A number of lanky boys of all ages appeared as suddenly and slimily as eels wakened by the crack of thunder. Some came from the waiting room, where they had been warming themselves by the red stove, or half asleep on the slat benches. Others uncoiled themselves from baggage trucks, or slid out of express wagons. 2 clambered down from the driver's seat of a hearse that stood backed up against the siding. They straightened their stooping shoulders and lifted their heads, and a flash of momentary animation kindled their dull eyes at that cold, vibrant scream, the world-wide call for men. It stirred them like the note of a trumpet. just as it had often stirred the man who was coming home tonight, in his boyhood. The night express shot red as a rocket from out of the eastward marshlands and wound along the river shore under the long lines of shivering poplars that sentinelled the meadows, the escaping steam hanging in grey masses against the pale sky and blotting out the Milky Way. In a moment the red glare from the headlights streamed up the snow-covered track before the siding and glittered on the wet black rails. The burly man with the dishevelled red beard walked swiftly up the platform toward the approaching train, uncovering his head as he went. The group of men behind him hesitated, glanced questioningly at one another, and awkwardly followed his example. The train stopped, and the crowd shuffled up to the express car just as the door was thrown open, the spare man in the G.A.B. suit thrusting his head forward with curiosity. The express messenger appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a young man in a long ulster and travelling cap. "Are Mr. Merrick's friends here?" inquired the young man. The group on the platform swayed and shuffled uneasily. Philip Phelps, the banker, responded with dignity. "We have come to take charge of the body. Mr. Merrick's father is very feeble and can't be about." "Send the agent out here," growled the express messenger, "and tell the operator to lend a hand." The coffin was got out of its rough box and down on the snowy platform. The townspeople drew back enough to make room for it, and then formed a close semicircle about it, looking curiously at the palm leaf which lay across the black cover. No one said anything. The baggage man stood by his truck, waiting to get at the trunks. The engine panted heavily, and the fireman dodged in and out among the wheels with his yellow torch and long oil can, snapping the spindle boxes. The young Bostonian, one of the dead sculptor's pupils who had come with the body, looked about him helplessly. He turned to the banker, the only one of that black, uneasy, stoop-shouldered group, who seemed enough of an individual to be addressed. "None of Mr. Merrick's brothers are here?" he asked uncertainly. The man with the red beard for the first time stepped up and joined the group. "No, they have not come yet. The family is scattered. The body will be taken directly to the house." He stooped and took hold of one of the handles of the coffin. "Take the long hill road up, Thompson. It'll be easier on the horses," called the liveryman as the undertaker snapped the door of the hearse and prepared to mount to the driver's seat. Laird, the red-bearded lawyer, turned again to the stranger. "We didn't know whether there would be anyone with him or not," he explained. "It's a long walk, so you'd better get up in the hack." He pointed to a single, battered conveyance, but the young man replied stiffly, "Thank you, but I think I will go with the hearse. If you don't object," turning to the undertaker, "I'll ride with you." They clambered up over the wheels and drove off in the starlight tipped the long, white hill toward the town. The lamps in the still village were shining from under the low, snow-burdened roofs, and beyond, on every side, the plains reached out into emptiness, peaceful and wide as the soft sky itself, and wrapped in a tangible white silence. When the hearse backed up to a wooden sidewalk before a naked, weather-beaten frame house, the same composite, ill-defined group that had stood upon the station siding was huddled about the gate. The front yard was an icy swamp, and a couple of warped planks, extending from the sidewalk to the door, made a sort of rickety footbridge. The gate hung on one hinge and was opened wide with difficulty. Stevens, the young stranger, noticed that something black was tied to the knob of the front door. The grating sound made by the casket as it was drawn from the hearse was answered by a scream from the house. The front door was wrenched open, and a tall, corpulent woman rushed out bareheaded into the snow and flung herself upon the coffin, shrieking, "My boy! My boy! And this is how you've come home to me!" As Stevens turned away and closed his eyes with a shudder of unutterable repulsion, another woman, also tall, but flat and angular, dressed entirely in black, darted out of the house and caught Mrs. Merrick by the shoulders, crying sharply, "Come, come, mother, you mustn't go on like this." Her tone changed to one of obsequious solemnity as she turned to the banker. "The parlour is ready, Mr. Phelps." The bearers carried the coffin along the narrow boards, while the undertaker ran ahead with the coffin rests. They bore it into a large unheated room that smelled of dampness and disuse and furniture polish, and set it down under a hanging lamp ornamented with jingling glass prisms, and before a Rogers group of John Alden and Priscilla, wreathed with smilax. Henry Stevens stared about him with the sickening conviction that there had been some horrible mistake, and that he had somehow arrived at the wrong destination. He looked painfully about over the clover-green Brussels, the fat plush upholstery, among the hand-painted china plaques and panels and vases, for some mark of identification, for something that might once conceivably have belonged to Harvey Merrick. It was not until he recognized his friend in the crayon portrait of a little boy in kilts and curls hanging above the piano that he felt willing to let any of these people approach the coffin. "Take the lid off, Mr. Thompson. Let me see my boy's face," wailed the elder woman between her sobs. This time Stevens looked fearfully, almost beseechingly, into her face, red and swollen under its masses of strong, black, shiny hair. He flushed, dropped his eyes, and then, almost incredulously, looked again. There was a kind of power about her face, a kind of brutal handsomeness, even, but it was scarred and furrowed by violence, and so coloured and coarsened by fiercer passions that grief seemed never to have laid a gentle finger there. The long nose was distended and knobbed at the end, and there were deep lines on either side of it. Her heavy black brows almost met across her forehead. Her teeth were large and square and set far apart, teeth that could tear. She filled the room. The men were obliterated, seemed tossed about like twigs in an angry water, and even Stevens felt himself being drawn into the whirlpool. The daughter, the tall, raw-boned woman in crape, with a mourning comb in her hair which curiously lengthened her long face, sat stiffly upon the sofa, her hands, conspicuous for their large knuckles, folded in her lap, her mouth and eyes drawn down, solemnly awaiting the opening of the coffin. Near the door stood a mulatto woman, evidently a servant in the house, with a timid bearing and an emaciated face pitifully sad and gentle. She was weeping silently, the corner of her calico apron lifted to her eyes, occasionally suppressing a long, quivering sob. Stevens walked over and stood beside her. Feeble steps were heard on the stairs, and an old man, tall and frail, odorous of pipe smoke, with shaggy, unkempt grey hair and a dingy beard, tobacco-stained about the mouth, entered uncertainly. He went slowly up to the coffin and stood, rolling a blue cotton handkerchief between his hands, seeming so pained and embarrassed by his wife's orgy of grief that he had no consciousness of anything else. "There, there, Annie dear, don't take on so," he quavered timidly, putting out a shaking hand and awkwardly patting her elbow. She turned with a cry and sank upon his shoulder with such violence that he tottered a little. He did not even glance toward the coffin, but continued to look at her with a dull, frightened, appealing expression, as a spaniel looks at the whip. His sunken cheeks slowly reddened and burned with miserable shame. When his wife rushed from the room, her daughter strode after her with set lips. The servant stole up to the coffin, bent over it for a moment, and then slipped away to the kitchen, leaving Stevens, the lawyer, and the father to themselves. The old man stood trembling and looking down at his dead son's face. The sculptor's splendid head seemed even more noble in its rigid stillness than in life. The dark hair had crept down upon the wide forehead. The face seemed strangely long, but in it there was not that beautiful and chaste repose which we expect to find in the faces of the dead. The brows were so drawn that there were 2 deep lines above the beaked nose, and the chin was thrust forward defiantly. It was as though the strain of life had been so sharp and bitter that death could not at once wholly relax the tension and smooth the countenance into perfect peace, as though he were still guarding something precious and holy, which might even yet be wrested from him. The old man's lips were working under his stained beard. He turned to the lawyer with timid deference. "Phelps and the rest are coming back to set up with Harve, ain't they?" he asked. "Thank 'ee, Jim, thank 'ee." He brushed the hair back gently from his son's forehead. "He was a good boy, Jim.
Always a good boy. He was as gentle as a child and kindest of 'em all, only we didn't none of us ever understand him." The tears trickled slowly down his beard and dropped upon the sculptor's coat. "Martin! Martin! Oh, Martin, come here!" his wife wailed from the top of the stairs. The old man started timorously. "Yes, Annie, I'm coming." He turned away, hesitated, stood for a moment in miserable indecision. Then he reached back and patted the dead man's hair softly and stumbled from the room. "Poor old man. I don't think he had any tears left. Seems as if his eyes would have gone dry long ago. At his age, nothing cuts very deep," remarked the lawyer. Something in his tone made Stevens glance up. While the mother had been in the room, the young man had scarcely seen anyone else. But now, from the moment he first glanced into Jim Laird's florid face and bloodshot eyes, he knew that he had found what he had been heart-sick at not finding before. The feeling, the understanding that must exist in someone, even here. The man was red as his beard, with features swollen and blurred by dissipation and a hot, blazing blue eye. His face was strained, that of a man who is controlling himself with difficulty, and he kept plucking at his beard with a sort of fierce resentment. Stevens, sitting by the window, watched him turn down the glaring lamp, still its jangling pendants with an angry gesture, and then stand with his hands locked behind him, staring down into the master's face. He could not help wondering what link there could have been between the porcelain vessel and so sooty a lump of potter's clay. From the kitchen an uproar was sounding. When the dining-room door opened, the import of it was clear. The mother was abusing the maid for having forgotten to make the dressing for the chicken salad which had been prepared for the watchers. Stevens had never heard anything in the least like it. It was injured, emotional, dramatic abuse, unique and masterly in its excruciating cruelty, as violent and unrestrained as had been her grief of 20 minutes before. With a shudder of disgust, the lawyer went into the dining-room and closed the door into the kitchen. "Poor Roxy's getting it now," he remarked when he came back. "The Merricks took her out of the poorhouse years ago, and if her loyalty would let her, I guess the poor old thing could tell tales that could curdle your blood. She's the mulatto woman who was standing in here a while ago, with her apron to her eyes. The old woman is a fury. There never was anybody like her for demonstrative piety and ingenious cruelty. She made Harvey's life a hell for him when he lived at home. He was so sick ashamed of it. I never could see how he kept himself so sweet." "He was wonderful," said Stevens slowly. "Wonderful. But until tonight I have never known how wonderful." "That is the true and eternal wonder of it, anyway, that it can come even from such a dung heap as this," the lawyer cried with a sweeping gesture which seemed to indicate much more than the four walls within which they stood. "I think I'll see whether I can get a little air. The room is so close I'm beginning to feel rather faint," murmured Stevens, struggling with one of the windows. The sash was stuck, however, and would not yield, so he sat down dejectedly and began pulling at his collar. The lawyer came over, loosened the sash with one blow of his red fist, and sent the window up a few inches. Stevens thanked him, but the nausea which had been gradually climbing into his throat for the last half-hour left him with but one desire, a desperate feeling that he must get away from this place with what was left of Harvey Merrick. Oh, he comprehended well enough now the quiet bitterness of that smile that he had seen so often on his master's lips. He remembered that once, when Merrick returned from a visit home, he brought with him a singularly feeling and suggestive bas-relief of a thin, faded old woman sitting and sewing something pinned to her knee, while a full-lipped, full-blooded little urchin, his trousers held up by a single gallows, stood beside her, impatiently twisting her gown to call her attention to a butterfly he had caught. Stevens, impressed by the tender and delicate modelling of the thin, tired face, had asked him if it were his mother. He remembered the dull flush that had burned up in the sculptor's face. The lawyer was sitting in a rocking-chair beside the coffin, his head thrown back and his eyes closed. Stevens looked at him earnestly,
puzzled at the line of the chin and wondering why a man should conceal a feature of such distinction under that disfiguring shock of beard. Suddenly, as though he felt the young sculptor's keen glance, he opened his eyes. "Was he always a good deal of an oyster?" he asked abruptly. "He was terribly shy as a boy." "Yes, he was an oyster, since you put it so," rejoined Stevens. "Although he could be very fond of people, he always gave one the impression of being detached. He disliked violent emotion. He was reflective and rather distrustful of himself, except, of course, as regarded his work. He was sure-footed enough there. He distrusted men pretty thoroughly, and women even more, yet somehow without believing ill of them. He was determined, indeed, to believe the best, but he seemed afraid to investigate." "A burnt dog dreads the fire," said the lawyer grimly, and closed his eyes. Stevens went on, reconstructing the whole miserable boyhood. All this raw, biting ugliness had been the portion of the man whose tastes were refined beyond the limits of the reasonable, whose mind was an exhaustless gallery of beautiful impressions, and so sensitive that the mere shadow of a poplar leaf flickering against the sunny wall would be etched and held there forever. Surely, if ever a man had the magic word in his fingertips, it was Merrick. Whatever he touched, he revealed its holiest secret, liberated it from enchantment, and restored it to its pristine loveliness, like the Arabian prince who fought the enchantress spell for spell. Upon whatever he had come in contact with, he had left a beautiful record of the experience, a sort of ethereal signature, a scent, a sound, a colour that was his own. Stevens understood now the real tragedy of his master's life, neither love nor wine, as many had conjectured, but a blow which had fallen earlier and cut deeper than these could have done, a shame not his, and yet so inescapably his, to bide in his heart from his very boyhood, and without, the frontier warfare, the yearning of a boy cast ashore upon a desert of newness and ugliness and sordidness, for all that is chastened and old and noble with traditions. At 11 o'clock the tall, flat woman in black crape entered, announced that the watchers were arriving, and asked them to step into the dining-room. As Stevens rose, the lawyer said dryly, "You go on. It'll be good experience for you, doubtless. As for me, I'm not equal to that crowd tonight. I've had 20 years of them." As Stevens closed the door after him, he glanced back at the lawyer, sitting by the coffin in the dim light, with his chin resting on his hand. The same misty group that had stood before the door of the express car shuffled into the dining-room. In the light of the kerosene lamp they separated and became individuals. The minister, a pale, feeble-looking man with white hair and blonde chin-whiskers, took his seat beside a small side table and placed his Bible upon it. The Grand Army man sat down behind the stove and tilted his chair back comfortably against the wall, fishing his quill toothpick from his waistcoat pocket. The two bankers, Phelps and Elder, sat off in a corner behind the dinner table, where they could finish their discussion of the next usury law and its effect on chattel security loans. The real estate agent, an old man with a smiling, hypocritical face, soon joined them. The coal and lumber dealer and the cattle shipper sat on opposite sides of the hard coal burner, their feet on the nickel work. Stevens took a book from his pocket and began to read. The talk around him ranged through various topics of local interest while the house was quieting down. When it was clear that the members of the family were in bed, the Grand Army man hitched his shoulders and, untangling his long legs, caught his heels on the rounds of his chair. "S'pose there'll be a will, Phelps?" he queried in his weak falsetto. The banker laughed disagreeably and began trimming his nails with a pearl-handled pocket-knife. "There'll scarcely be any need for one, will there?" he queried in his turn. The restless Grand Army man shifted his position again, getting his knees still nearer his chin. "Why, the old man says Harv's done right well lately," he chirped. The other banker spoke up. "I reckon he means by that Harv ain't asked him to mortgage any more farms lately, so as he could go on with his education. Seems like my mind don't reach back to a time when Harv wasn't being edicated," tittered the Grand Army man. There was a general chuckle. The minister took out his handkerchief and blew his nose sonorously. Banker Phelps closed his knife with a snap. "It's too bad the old man's sons didn't turn out better," he remarked with reflective authority. "They never hung together. He spent money enough on Harve to stock a dozen cattle farms, and he might as well have poured it into Sand Creek. If Harve had stayed at home and helped nurse what little they had, and gone into stock on the old man's bottom farm, they might all have been well fixed. But the old man had to trust everything to tenants, and was cheated right and left." "Harve never could have handled stock none," interposed the cattleman. "He hadn't it in him to be sharp. Do you remember when he bought Sanders mules for 8-year-olds, when everybody in town knew that Sanders' father-in-law give 'em to his wife for a wedding present 18 years before, and they was full-grown mules then?" Everyone chuckled, and the Grand Army man rubbed his knees with a spasm of childish delight. "Harve never was much account for anything practical, and he sure was never fond of work," began the coal and lumber dealer. "I mind the last time he was home, the day he left, when the old man was out to the barn helping his hand hitch up to take Harve to the train, and Cal Moots was patching up the fence. Harve, he come out on the step and sings out in his ladylike voice, 'Cal Moots, please come cord my trunk.'" "That's Harve for ya," approved the Grand Army man gleefully. "I can hear him howling yet when he was a big feller in long pants, and his mother used to whale him with a rawhide in the barn for letting the cows get foundered in the cornfield when he was driving 'em home from pasture. He killed a cow of mine that-a-way onct, a pure Jersey and the best milker I had, and the old man had to put up for her. Harve, he was watching the sunset cross the marshes when the animile got away. He argued that sunset was uncommon fine." "Where the old man made his mistake was in sending the boy east to school," said Phelps, stroking his goatee and speaking in a deliberate, judicial tone. "There was where he got his head full of traipsing to Paris and all such folly. What Harve needed, of all people, was a course in some first-class Kansas City business college." The letters were swimming before Stevens's eyes. Was it possible that these men did not understand, that the palm on the coffin meant nothing to them? The very name of their town would have remained forever buried in the postal guide, had it not now and again been mentioned in the world in connection with Harvey Merrick's. He remembered what his master had said to him on the day of his death, after the congestion of both lungs had shut off any probability of recovery, and the sculptor had asked his pupil to send his body home. "It's not a pleasant place to be lying, while the world is moving and doing and bettering," he had said with a feeble smile. "But it rather seems as though we ought to go back to the place we came from in the end. The townspeople will come in for a look at me, and after they have had their way, I shan't have much to fear from the judgment of God. The wings of the Victory in there," with a weak gesture toward his studio, "will not shelter me." The cattleman took up the comment. "40's young for Merrick's to cash in. They usually hang on pretty well. Probably he helped it along with whiskey." His mother's people were not long-lived, and Harvey never had a robust constitution, said the minister mildly. He would have liked to say more. He had been the boy's Sunday school teacher, and had been fond of him, but he felt that he was not in a position to speak. His own sons had turned out badly, and it was not a year since one of them had made his last trip home in the express car, shot in a gambling house in the Black Hills. "Nevertheless, there is no disputing that Harve frequently looked upon the wine when it was red, also variegated, and it sure made an uncommon fool of him," moralized the cattleman. Just then the door leading into the parlour rattled loudly, and everyone started involuntarily, looking relieved when only Jim Laird came out. His red face was convulsed with anger, and the Grand Army man ducked his head when he saw the spark in his blue bloodshot eye. They were all afraid of Jim. He was a drunkard, but he could twist the law to suit his client's needs as no other man in all western Kansas could do, and there were many who tried. The lawyer closed the door gently behind him, leaned back against it, and folded his arms, cocking his head a little to one side. When he assumed this attitude in the courtroom, ears were always pricked up, as it usually foretold a flood of withering sarcasm.
I've been with you gentlemen before," he began in a dry, even tone, "when you've sat by the coffins of boys born and raised in this town. And, if I remember rightly, you were never any too well satisfied when you checked them up. What's the matter now? Why is it that reputable young men are as scarce as millionaires in Sand City? It might almost seem to a stranger that there was something the matter with your progressive town. Why did Reuben Sayer, the brightest young lawyer you ever turned out, after he had come home from the university as straight as a die, take to drinking and forge a check and shoot himself? Why did Bill Merritt's son die of the shakes in a saloon in Omaha? Why was Mr. Thomas's son here shot in a gambling house? Why did young Adams burn his mill to beat the insurance companies and go to the pen?" The lawyer paused and unfolded his arms, laying one clenched fist quietly on the table. "I'll tell you why. Because you drummed nothing but money and knavery into their ears from the time they wore knickerbockers. Because you carped away at them as you've been carping here tonight, holding our friends Phelps and Elder up to them for their models, as our grandfathers held up George Washington and John Adams. But the boys, worse luck, were young and raw at the business you put them to, and how could they match coppers with such artists as Phelps and Elder? You wanted them to be successful rascals. They were only unsuccessful ones. That's all the difference. There was only one boy ever raised in this borderland between ruffianism and civilization that didn't come to grief, and you hated Harvey Merrick more for winning out than you hated all the other boys who got under the wheels. Lord, Lord, how you did hate him. Phelps here is fond of saying that he could buy and sell us all out any time he's a mind to, but he knew Harv wouldn't have given a tinker's damn for his bank and all his cattle farms put together, and a lack of appreciation that way goes hard with Phelps. Old Nimrod here thinks Harv drank too much, and this from such as Nimrod and me. Brother Elder says Harv was too free with the old man's money, fell short in filial consideration maybe. Well, we can all remember the right tone in which Brother Elder swore his own father was a liar in the county court, and we all know that the old man came out of that partnership with his son as bare as a sheared lamb. But maybe I'm getting personal, and I'd better be driving ahead at what I want to say." The lawyer paused a moment, squared his heavy shoulders, and went on. "Harvey Merrick and I went to school together back east. We were dead in earnest, and we wanted you all to be proud of us some day. We meant to be great men. Even I, and I haven't lost my sense of humor, gentlemen, I meant to be a great man. I came back here to practice, and I found you didn't in the least want me to be a great man. You wanted me to be a shrewd lawyer. Oh, yes. Our veteran here wanted me to get him an increase of pension because he had dyspepsia. Phelps wanted a new county survey that would put the widow Wilson's little bottom farm inside his south line. Elder wanted to lend money at 5% a month and get it collected. Old Stark here wanted to wheedle old women up in Vermont into investing their annuities in real estate mortgages that are not worth the paper they are written on. Oh, you needed me hard enough, and you'll go on needing me. And that's why I'm not afraid to plug the truth home to you this once. Well, I came back here and became the damned shyster you wanted me to be. You pretend to have some sort of respect for me, and yet you'll stand up and throw mud at Harvey Merrick, whose soul you couldn't dirty and whose hands you couldn't tie. Oh, you're a discriminating lot of Christians. There have been times when the sight of Harvey's name in some Eastern paper has made me hang my head like a whipped dog. And again, times when I like to think of him off there in the world, away from all this hog wallow, doing his great work and climbing the big clean upgrade he'd set for himself. And we, now that we've fought and lied and sweated and stolen, and hated as only the disappointed strugglers in a bitter, dead little western town know how to do, what have we got to show for it? Harvey Merrick wouldn't have given one sunset over your marshes for all you've got put together, and you know it. It's not for me to say why, in the inscrutable wisdom of God, a genius should ever have been called from this place of hatred and bitter waters. But I want this Boston man to know that the drivel he's been hearing tonight is the only tribute any truly great man could ever have from such a lot of sick, sidetracked, burnt-dog, land-poor sharks as the here present financiers of Sand City, upon which town may God have mercy." The lawyer thrust out his hand to Stevens as he passed him, caught up his overcoat in the hall, and had left the house before the Grand Army man had had time to lift his ducked head and crane his long neck about at his fellows. Next day Jim Laird was drunk and unable to attend the funeral services. Stevens called twice at his office, but was compelled to start east without seeing him. He had a presentiment that he would hear from him again, and left his address on the lawyer's table. But if Laird found it, he never acknowledged it. The thing in him that Harvey Merrick had loved must have gone underground with Harvey Merrick's coffin, for it never spoke again, and Jim got the cold he died of, driving across the Colorado mountains to defend one of Phelps's sons, who had gotten into trouble out there by cutting government timber. End of The Sculptor's Funeral by Willa Cather. Read by Lisa Reichert.
Greville Fane by Henry James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Burlinson. Greville Fane. Coming in to dress for dinner, I found a telegram. "Mrs. Stormer dying. Can you give us half a column for tomorrow evening? Let her off easy, but not too easy." I was late. I was in a hurry. I had very little time to think, but at a venture I dispatched a reply. "Will do what I can." It was not till I had dressed and was rolling away to dinner that, in the hansom, I bethought myself of the difficulty of the condition attached. The difficulty was not, of course, in letting her off easy, but in qualifying that indulgence. "I simply won't qualify it," I said to myself. I didn't admire her, but I liked her, and I had known her so long that I almost felt heartless in sitting down at such an hour to a feast of indifference. I must have seemed abstracted, for the early years of my acquaintance with her came back to me. I spoke of her to the lady I had taken down, but the lady I had taken down had never heard of Greville Fane. I tried my other neighbour, who pronounced her books too vile. I had never thought them very good, but I should let her off easier than that. I came away early for the express purpose of driving to ask about her. The journey took time, for she lived in the northwest district in the neighbourhood of Primrose Hill. My apprehension that I should be too late was justified in a fuller sense than I had attached to it. I had only feared that the house would be shut up. There were lights in the windows, and a temperate tinkle of my bell brought a servant immediately to the door. But poor Mrs. Stormer had passed into a state in which the residence of no earthly knocker was to be feared. A lady in the hall, hovering behind the servant, came forward when she heard my voice. I recognized Lady Luard, but she had mistaken me for the doctor. "Excuse my appearing at such an hour," I said. "It was the first possible moment after I heard." "It's all over," Lady Luard replied. "Dearest mamma." She stood there under the lamp with her eyes on me. She was very tall, very stiff, very cold, and always looked as if these things, and some others beside, in her dress, her manner, and even her name, were an implication that she was very admirable. I had never been able to follow the argument, but that is a detail. I expressed briefly and frankly what I felt, while the little mottled maidservant flattened herself against the wall of the narrow passage, and tried to look detached without looking indifferent. It was not a moment to make a visit, and I was on the point of retreating when Lady Luard arrested me with a queer, casual, drawling, Would you perhaps be writing something?" I felt for an instant like an interviewer, which I was not, but I pleaded guilty to this intention, on which she rejoined, "I'm so very glad, but I think my brother would like to see you." I detested her brother, but it wasn't an occasion to act this out, so I suffered myself to be inducted, to my surprise, into a small back room which I immediately recognised as the scene, during the later years, of Mrs. Stormer's imperturbable industry. Her table was there, the battered and blotted accessory to innumerable literary lapses, with its contracted space for the arms. She wrote only from the elbow down, and the confusion of scrappy, scribbled sheets which had already become literary remains. Leolin was also there, smoking a cigarette before the fire and looking impudent even in his grief, sincere as it well might have been. To meet him, to greet him, I had to make a sharp effort, for the air that he wore to me as he stood before me was quite that of his mother's murderer. She lay silent forever upstairs, as dead as an unsuccessful book, and his swaggering erectness was a kind of symbol of his having killed her. I wondered if he had already, with his sister, been calculating what they would get for the poor papers on the table. But I had not long to wait to learn, for in reply to the scanty words of sympathy I addressed him, he puffed out, "It's miserable, miserable, yes, but she has left 3 books complete." His words had the oddest effect. They converted the cramped little room into a seat of trade, and made the book wonderfully feasible. He would certainly get all that could be got for the 3. Lady Luard explained to me that her husband had been with them, but had had to go down to the house. To her brother she explained that I was going to write something, and to me again she made clear that she hoped I would do mamma justice. She added that she didn't think that this had ever been done. She said to her brother, "Don't you think there are some things he ought thoroughly to understand?" And on his instantly exclaiming, "Oh, thoroughly, thoroughly," she went on rather austerely, "I mean about mamma's birth." "Yes, and her connections," Leolin added. I professed every willingness, and for 5 minutes I listened, but it would be too much to say that I understood. I don't even now, but it is not important. My vision was of other matters than those they put before me, and while they desired there should be no mistake about their ancestors, I became more and more lucid about themselves. I got away as soon as possible and walked home through the great, dusky, empty London, the best of all conditions for thought. By the time I reached my door my little article was practically composed, ready to be transferred on the morrow from the polished plate of fancy. I believe it attracted some notice, was thought graceful, and was said to be by someone else. I had to be pointed without being lively, and it took some tact. But what I said was much less interesting than what I thought, especially during the half-hour I spent in my armchair by the fire, smoking the cigar I always light before going to bed. I went to sleep there, I believe, but I continued to moralize about Greville Fane. I am reluctant to lose that retrospect altogether, and this is a dim little memory of it, a document not to serve. The dear woman had written 100 stories, but none so curious as her own. When I first knew her, she had published half a dozen fictions, and I believe I had also perpetrated a novel. She was more than a dozen years older than I, but she was a person who always acknowledged her relativity. It was not so very long ago, but in London, amid the big waves of the present, even a near horizon gets hidden. I met her at some dinner and took her down, rather flattered at offering my arm to a celebrity. She didn't look like one, with her matronly, mild, inanimate face, but I supposed her greatness would come out in her conversation. I gave it all the opportunities I could, but I was not disappointed when I found her only a dull, kind woman. This was why I liked her. She rested me so from literature. To myself, literature was an irritation, a torment, but Greville Fane slumbered in the intellectual part of it like a Creole in a hammock. She was not a woman of genius, but her faculty was so special, so much a gift out of hand, that I have often wondered why she fell below that distinction. This was doubtless because the transaction, in her case, had remained incomplete. Genius always pays for the gift, feels the debt, and she was placidly unconscious of obligation. She could invent stories by the yard, but she couldn't write a page of English. She went down to her grave without suspecting that though she had contributed volumes to the diversion of her contemporaries, she had not contributed a sentence to the language. This had not prevented bushels of criticism from being heaped upon her head. She was worth a couple of columns any day to the weekly papers, in which it was shown that her pictures of life were dreadful, but her style really charming. She asked me to come and see her, and I went. She lived then in Montpelier Square, which helped me to see how dissociated her imagination was from her character. An industrious widow, devoted to her family stint, to meeting the butcher and baker and making a home for her son and daughter. From the moment she took her pen in her hand, she became a creature of passion. She thought the English novel deplorably wanting in that element, and the task she had cut out for herself was to supply the deficiency. Passion in high life was the general formula of this work, for her imagination was at home only in the most exalted circles. She adored in truth the aristocracy, and they constituted for her the romance of the world, or, what is more to the point, the prime material of fiction. Their beauty and luxury, their loves and revenges, their temptations and surrenders, their immoralities and diamonds were as familiar to her as the blots on her writing table. She was not a belated producer of the old fashionable novel. She had a cleverness and a modernness of her own. She had freshened up the fly-blown tinsel. She turned off plots by the hundred, and, so far as her flying quill could convey her, was perpetually going abroad. Her types, her illustrations, her tone were nothing if not cosmopolitan. She recognized nothing less provincial than European society, and her fine folk knew each other and made love to each other from Doncaster to Bucharest. She had an idea that she resembled Balzac, and her favourite historical characters were Lucien de Rubempré and the Vidame de Pamiers. I must add that when I once asked her who the latter personage was, she was unable to tell me. She was very brave and healthy and cheerful, very abundant and innocent and wicked. She was clever and vulgar and snobbish, and never so intensely British as when she was particularly foreign. This combination of qualities had brought her early success, and I remember having heard with wonder and envy of what she got in those days for a novel. The revelation gave me a pang. It was such a proof that, practicing a wholly different style, I should never make my fortune. And yet when, as I knew her better, she told me her real tariff, and I saw how rumour had quadrupled it, I liked her enough to be sorry. After a while I discovered too that if she got less it was not that I was to get any more. My failure never had what Mrs. Stormer would have called the banality of being relative. It was always admirably absolute. She lived at ease, however, in those days. Ease is exactly the word, though she produced 3 novels a year. She scorned me when I spoke of difficulty. It was the only thing that made her angry. If I hinted that a work of art required a tremendous licking into shape, she thought it a pretension and a pose. She never recognized the torment of form. The furthest she went was to introduce into one of her books, in satire, her hand was heavy, a young poet who was always talking about it. I couldn't quite understand her irritation on this score, for she had nothing at stake in the matter. She had a shrewd perception that form, in prose at least, never recommended anyone to the public we were condemned to address, and therefore she lost nothing, putting her private humiliation aside, by not having any. She made no pretence of producing works of art, but had comfortable tea-drinking hours in which she freely confessed herself a common pastry cook, dealing in such tarts and puddings as would bring customers to the shop. She put in plenty of sugar and cochineal, or whatever it was that give these articles a rich and attractive colour. She had a serene superiority to observation and opportunity, which constituted an inexpugnable strength, and would enable her to go on indefinitely. It is only real success that wanes. It is only solid things that melt. Greville Fane's ignorance of life was a resource still more unfailing than the most approved receipt. On her saying once that the day would come when she should have written herself out, I answered, "Ah, you look into fairyland and the fairies love you, and they never change. Fairyland is always there. It always was from the beginning of time, and it always will be to the end. They've given you the key, and you can always open the door. With me it's different. I try in my clumsy way to be in some direct relation to life." "Oh, bother your direct relation to life," she used to reply, for she was always annoyed by the phrase, which would not in the least prevent her from using it when she wished to try for style. With no more prejudices than an old sausage mill, she would give forth again with patient punctuality any poor verbal scrap that had been dropped into her. I cheered her with saying that the dark day at the end would be for the like of me, inasmuch as, going in our small way by experience and observation, we depended not on a revelation, but on a little tiresome process. Observation depended on opportunity, and where should we be when opportunity failed? One day she told me that as the novelist's life was so delightful, and during the good years at least, such a comfortable support. She had these staggering optimisms. She meant to train up her boy to follow it. She took the ingenious view that it was a profession like another, and that therefore everything was to be gained by beginning young and serving an apprenticeship. Moreover, the education would be less expensive than any other special course, inasmuch as she could administer it herself. She didn't profess to keep a school, but she could at least teach her own child. It was not that she was so very clever, but, she confessed to me as if she were afraid I would laugh at her, that he was. I didn't laugh at her for that, for I thought the boy sharp. I had seen him at sundry times. He was well grown and good looking and unabashed, and both he and his sister made me wonder about their defunct papa, concerning whom the little I knew was that he had been a clergyman. I explained them to myself by suppositions and imputations possibly unjust to the departed. So little were they, superficially at least, the children of their mother. There used to be on an easel in her drawing-room an enlarged photograph of her husband, done by some horrible posthumous process, and draped as to its florid frame with a silken scarf, which testified to the candour of Greville Fane's bad taste. It made him look like an unsuccessful tragedian, but it was not a thing to trust. He may have been a successful comedian. Of the two children, the girl was the elder, and struck me in all her younger years as singularly colourless. She was only very long, like an undecipherable letter. It was not till Mrs. Stormer came back from a protracted residence abroad that Ethel, which was this young lady's name, began to produce the effect which was afterwards remarkable in her of a certain kind of high resolution. She made one apprehend that she meant to do something for herself. She was long-necked and near-sighted and striking, and I thought I had never seen sweet 17 in a form so hard and high and dry. She was cold and affected and ambitious, and she carried an eyeglass with a long handle, which she put up whenever she wanted not to see. She had come out, as the phrase is, immensely, and yet I felt as if she was surrounded with a spiked iron railing. What she meant to do for herself was to marry, and it was the only thing, I think, that she meant to do for any one else. Yet who would be inspired to clamber over that bristling barrier? What flower of tenderness or of intimacy would such an adventurer conceive as his reward? This was for Sir Baldwin Luard to say, but he naturally never confided to me the secret. He was a joyless, jokeless young man, with the air of having other secrets as well, and a determination to get on politically that was indicated by his never having been known to commit himself, as regards any proposition whatever, beyond an exclamatory "Oh!" His wife and he must have conversed mainly in prim ejaculations, but they understood sufficiently that they were kindred spirits. I remember being angry with Greville Fane when she announced these nuptials to me as magnificent. I remember asking her what splendour there was in the union of the daughter of a woman of genius with an irredeemable mediocrity. "Oh, he's awfully clever," she said, but she blushed for the maternal fib. What she meant was that though Sir Baldwin's estates were not vast, he had a dreary house in South Kensington, and a still drearier hall somewhere in Essex, which was let. The connection was a smarter one than a child of hers could have aspired to form. In spite of the social bravery of her novels, she took a very humble and dingy view of herself, so that of all her productions, My Daughter Lady Luard was quite the one she was proudest of. That personage thought her mother very vulgar, and was distressed and perplexed by the occasional license of her pen, but had a complicated attitude in regard to this indirect connection with literature. So far as it was lucrative, her ladyship approved of it, and could compound with the inferiority of the pursuit by doing practical justice to some of its advantages. I had reason to know, my reason was simply that poor Mrs. Stormer told me, that she suffered the inky fingers to press an occasional bank-note into her palm. On the other hand, she deplored the peculiar style to which Greville Fane had devoted herself, and wondered where an author who had the convenience of so ladylike a daughter could have picked up such views about the best society. "She might know better with Leolin and me," Lady Luard had been known to remark, but it appeared that some of Greville Fane's superstitions were incurable. She didn't live in Lady Luard's society, and the best was not good enough for her. She must make it still better. I could see that this necessity grew upon her during the days she spent abroad, when I had glimpses of her in the shifting sojourns that lay in the path of my annual ramble. She betook herself from Germany to Switzerland, and from Switzerland to Italy. She favoured cheap places, and set up her desk in the smaller capitals. I took a look at her whenever I could, and I always asked how Leolin was getting on. She gave me beautiful accounts of him, and whenever it was possible, the boy was produced for my edification. I had entered from the first into the joke of his career. I pretended to regard him as a consecrated child. It had been a joke for Mrs. Stormer at first, but the boy himself had been shrewd enough to take the matter serious. If his mother accepted the principle that the intending novelist cannot begin too early to see life, Leolin was not interested in hanging back from the application of it. He was eager to qualify himself, and took to cigarettes at 10 on the highest literary grounds. His poor mother gazed at him with extravagant envy, and like Desdemona wished heaven had made her such a man. She explained to me more than once that in her profession she had found her sex a dreadful drawback. She loved the story of Madame George Sand's early rebellion against this hindrance, and believed that if she had worn trousers she could have written as well as that lady. Leolin had for the career at least the qualification of trousers, and as he grew older he recognized its importance by laying in an immense assortment. He grew up in gorgeous apparel, which was his way of interpreting his mother's system. Whenever I met her I found her still under the impression that she was carrying this system out, and that Leolin's training was bearing fruit. She was giving him experience, she was giving him impressions, she was putting a gagne-pain into his hand. It was another name for spoiling him with the best conscience in the world. The queerest pictures come back to me of this period of the good lady's life, and of the extraordinarily virtuous, muddled, bewildering tenor of it. She had an idea that she was seeing foreign manners as well as her petticoats would allow, but in reality She was not saying anything, least of all, fortunately, how much she was laughed at. She drove her whimsical pen at Dresden and at Florence, and produced in all places and at all times the same romantic and ridiculous fictions. She carried about her box of properties, and fished out promptly the familiar, tarnished old puppets. She believed in them when others couldn't, and as they were like nothing that was to be seen under the sun, it was impossible to prove by comparison that they were wrong. You can't compare birds and fishes. You could only feel that as Greville Fane's characters had the fine plumage of the former species, human beings must be of the latter. It would have been droll if it had not been so exemplary to see her tracing the loves of the duchesses beside the innocent cribs of her children. The immoral and the maternal lived together in her diligent days on the most comfortable terms, and she stopped curling the moustaches of her guardsmen to pat the heads of her babes. She was haunted by solemn spinsters who came to tea from continental pensions, and by unsophisticated Americans who told her she was just loved in their country. "I'd rather be just paid there," she usually replied, for this tribute of transatlantic opinion was the only thing that galled her. The Americans went away thinking her coarse, though as the author of so many beautiful love stories, she was disappointing to most of these pilgrims, who had not expected to find a shy, stout, ruddy lady in a cap like a crumbled pyramid. She wrote about the affections and the impossibility of controlling them, but she talked of the price of pension and the convenience of an English chemist. She devoted much thought and many thousands of francs to the education of her daughter, who spent 3 years at a very superior school at Dresden, receiving wonderful instruction in sciences, arts, and tongues, and who, taking a different line from Leoline, was to be brought up wholly as a femme du monde. The girl was musical and philological. She made a specialty of languages, and learned enough about them to be inspired with a great contempt for her mother's artless accents. Greville Fane's French and Italian were droll. The imitative faculty had been denied her, and she had an unequalled gift, especially pen in hand, of squeezing big mistakes into small opportunities. She knew it, but she didn't care. Correctness was the virtue in the world that, like her heroes and heroines, she valued least. Ethel, who had perceived in her pages some remarkable lapses, undertook at one time to revise her proofs, but I remember her telling me a year after the girl had left school that this function had been very briefly exercised. "She can't read me," said Mrs. Stormer. "I offend her taste. She tells me that at Dresden, at school, I was never allowed." The good lady seemed surprised at this, having the best conscience in the world about her lucubrations. She had never meant to fly in the face of anything, and considered that she grovelled before the Rhadamanthus of the English Literary Tribunal, the celebrated and awful young person. I assured her as a joke that she was frightfully indecent. She hadn't, in fact, that reality any more than any other, my purpose being solely to prevent her from guessing that her daughter had dropped her not because she was immoral, but because she was vulgar. I used to figure her children closeted together, and asking each other, while they exchanged a gaze of dismay, why should she be so, and so fearfully so, when she has the advantage of our society? Shouldn't we have taught her better?" Then I imagined their recognizing with a blush and a shrug that she was unteachable, irreformable. Indeed she was, poor lady, but it is never fair to read by the light of taste things that were not written by it. Greville Fane had, in the topsy-turvy, a serene good faith that ought to have been safe from illusion, like a stutter or a faux pas. She didn't make her son ashamed of the profession to which he was destined, however. She only made him ashamed of the way she herself exercised it. But he bore his humiliation much better than his sister, for he was ready to take for granted that he should one day restore the balance. He was a canny and far-seeing youth, with appetites and aspirations, and he had not a scruple in his composition. His mother's theory of the happy knack he could pick up deprived him of the wholesome discipline required to prevent young idlers from becoming cads. He had abroad a casual tutor and a snatch or two of a Swiss school, but no consecutive study, no prospect of a university or a degree. It may be imagined with what zeal, as the years went on, he entered into the pleasantry of there being no manual so important to him as the massive book of life. It was an expensive volume to peruse, but Mrs. Stormer was willing to lay out a sum in which she would have called her première frais. Ethel disapproved. She thought this education far too unconventional for an English gentleman. Her voice was for Eton and Oxford, or for any public school. She would have resigned herself, with the army to follow. But Leolin never was afraid of his sister, and they visibly disliked, though they sometimes agreed to assist, each other. They would combine to work the oracle, to keep their mother at her desk. When she came back to England telling me she had got all the continent could give her, Leolin was a broad-shouldered, red-faced young man with an immense wardrobe and an extraordinary assurance of manner. She was fondly obstinate about her having taken the right course with him, and proud of all that he knew and had seen. He was now quite ready to begin, and a little while later she told me he had begun. He had written something tremendously clever, and it was coming out in the Cheapside. I believe it came out. I had no time to look for it. I never heard anything about it. I took for granted that if this contribution had passed through his mother's hands, it had practically become a specimen of her own genius, and it was interesting to consider Mrs. Stormer's future in the light of her trying to write her son's novels as well as her own. This was not the way she looked at it herself. She took the charming ground that he would help her to write hers. She used to tell me that he supplied passages of the greatest value to her own work, all sorts of technical things about hunting and yachting and wine, that she couldn't be expected to get very straight. It was all so much practice for him, and so much alleviation for her. I was unable to identify these pages, for I had long since ceased to keep up with Greville Fane, but I was quite able to believe that the wine question had been put, by Leolin's good offices, on a better footing, for the dear lady used to mix her drinks. She was perpetually serving the most splendid suppers, in the queerest fashion. I could see that he was willing enough to accept a commission to look after that department. It occurred to me indeed, when Mrs. Stormer settled in England again, that by making a shrewd use of both her children, she might be able to rejuvenate her style. Ethel had come back to gratify her young ambition, and if she couldn't take her mother into society, she would at least go into it herself. Silently, stiffly, almost grimly, this young lady held up her head, clenched her long teeth, squared her lean elbows, and made her way up the staircases she had elected. The only communication she ever made to me, the only effusion of confidence which she ever honoured me, was when she said, "I don't want to know the people mamma knows. I mean to know others." I took due note of the remark, for I was not one of the others. I couldn't trace therefore the steps of her process. I could only admire it at a distance, and congratulate her mother on the results. The results were that Ethel went to big parties, and got people to take her. Some of them were people she had met abroad, and others were people whom the people she had met abroad had met. They ministered alike to Miss Ethel's convenience, and I wondered how she extracted so many favours without the expenditure of a smile. Her smile was the dimmest thing in the world, diluted lemonade without sugar, and she had arrived precociously at social wisdom, recognizing that if she was neither pretty enough, nor rich enough, nor clever enough, she could at least in her muscular youth be rude enough. Therefore, if she was able to tell her mother what really took place in the mansions of the great, give her notes to work from, the quill could be driven at home to better purpose, and precisely at a moment when it would have to be more active than ever. But if she did tell, it would appear that poor Mrs. Stormer didn't believe. As regards many points this was not a wonder. At any rate, I heard nothing of Greville Fane's having developed a new manner. She had only one manner from start to finish, as Leland would have said. She was tired at last, but she mentioned to me that she couldn't afford to pause. She continued to speak of Leland's work as the great hope of their future. She had saved no money, though the young man wore to my sense an aspect more and more professional, if you like, but less and less literary. At the end of a couple of years there was something monstrous in the impudence with which he played his part in the comedy. When I wondered how she could play her part, I had to perceive that her good faith was complete, and that what kept it so was simply her extravagant fondness. She loved the young impostor with a simple, blind, benighted love, and of all the heroes of romance who had passed before her eyes, he was by far the most brilliant. He was at any rate the most real. She could touch him, pay for him, suffer for him, worship him. He made her think of her princes and dukes, and when she wished to fix these figures in her mind's eye, she thought of her boy. She had often told me that she was carried away by her own creations, and she was certainly carried away by Leland. He vivified by potentialities at least the whole question of youth and passion. She held, not unjustly, that the sincere novelist should feel the whole flood of life. She acknowledged with regret that she had not had time to feel it herself, and it was a joy to her that the deficiency might be supplied by the sight of the way it was rushing through this magnificent young man. She exhorted him, I suppose, to let it rush. She wrung her own flaccid little sponge into the torrent. I knew not what passed between them in her hours of tuition, but I gathered that she mainly impressed on him that the great thing was to live, because that gave you material. He asked nothing better. He collected material, and the formula served as a universal pretext. You had only to look at him to see that, with his rings and breastpins, his cross-barred jackets, his early embonpoint, his eyes that looked like imitation jewels, his various indications of a dense, full-blown temperament, his idea of life was singularly vulgar, but he was not so far wrong as that his response to his mother's expectations was not in a high degree practical. If she had imposed a profession on him from his tenderest years, it was exactly a profession that he followed. The two were not quite the same, inasmuch as his was simply to live at her expense, but at least she couldn't say that he hadn't taken a line. If she insisted on believing in him, he offered himself to the sacrifice. My impression is that her secret dream was that he should have a liaison with a countess, and he persuaded her without difficulty that he had one. I don't know what countesses are capable of, but I have a clear notion of what Leland was. He didn't persuade his sister, who despised him. She wished to work her mother in her own way, and I asked myself why the girl's judgment of him didn't make me like her better. It was because it didn't save her, after all, from a mute agreement with him to go halves. There were moments when I couldn't help looking hard into his atrocious young eyes, challenging him to confess his fantastic fraud and give it up. Not a little tacit conversation passed between us in this way, but he had always the best of it. If I said, "Oh, come now, with me you needn't keep it up. Plead guilty and I'll let you off," he wore the most ingenuous, the most candid expression, in the depths of which I could read, "Oh yes, I know it exasperates you. That's just why I do it." He took the line of earnest inquiry, talked about Balzac and Flaubert, asked me if I thought Dickens did exaggerate, and Thackeray ought to be called a pessimist. Once he came to see me at his mother's suggestion, he declared, on purpose to ask me how far, in my opinion, in the English novel, one really might venture to go. He was not resigned to the usual pruderies, he suffered under them already. He struck out the brilliant ideas that nobody knew how far we might go, for nobody had ever tried. Did I think he might safely try? Would it injure his mother if he did? He would rather disgrace himself by his timidities than injure his mother. But certainly someone ought to try. Wouldn't I try? Couldn't I be prevailed upon to look at it as a duty? Surely the ultimate point ought to be fixed. He was worried, haunted by the question. He patronized me unblushingly, made me feel like a foolish amateur, a helpless novice, inquired into my habits of work, and conveyed to me that I was utterly vieux jeu and had not the advantage of an early training. I had not been brought up from the germ. I knew nothing of life, didn't go at it on his system. He had dipped into French feuilletons and picked up plenty of phrases, and he made a much better show and talk than his poor mother, who had never time to read anything and could only be vivid with her pen. If I didn't kick him downstairs, it was because he would have alighted on her at the bottom. When she went to live at Primrose Hill, I called upon her and found her weary and wasted. It had waned a good deal, the elation caused the year before by Ethel's marriage. The foam on the cup had subsided, and there was a bitterness in the draught. She had had to take a cheaper house, and she had to work still harder to pay even for that. Sir Baldwin was obliged to be close. His charges were fearful, and the dream of her living with her daughter, a vision she had never mentioned to me, must be renounced. I would have helped with things, and I could have lived perfectly in one room, she said. I would have paid for everything, and, after all, I'm someone, ain't I? But I don't fit in, and Ethel tells me there are tiresome people she must receive. I can help them from here, no doubt, better than from there. She told me once, you know, what she thinks of my picture of life. Mamma, your picture of life is preposterous. No doubt it is, but she's vexed with me for letting my prices go down, and I had to write 3 novels to pay for all her marriage cost me. I did it very well, I mean the outfit and the wedding, but that's why I'm here. At any rate, she doesn't want a dingy old woman in her house. I should give it an atmosphere of literary glory, but literary glory is only the eminence of nobodies. Besides, she doubts my glory. She knows I'm glorious only at Peckham and Hackney. She doesn't want her friends to ask if I've never known nice people. She can't tell them I've never been in society. She tried to teach me better once, but I couldn't learn. It would seem, too, as if Peckham and Hackney had had enough of me, for, don't tell anyone, I've had to take less for my last than I ever took for anything. I asked her how little this had been, not from curiosity, but in order to upbraid her, more disinterestedly than Lady Luard had done for such concessions. She answered, I'm ashamed to tell you, and then she began to cry. I had never seen her break down, and I was proportionately moved. She sobbed like a frightened child over the extinction of her vogue and the exhaustion of her vein. Her little workroom seemed indeed a barren place to grow flowers, and I wondered, in the after years, for she continued to produce and publish, by what desperate and heroic process she dragged them out of the soil. I remember asking her on that occasion what had become of Leolin, and how much longer she intended to allow him to amuse himself at her cost. She rejoined with spirit, wiping her eyes, that he was down at Brighton, hard at work. He was in the midst of a novel, and that he felt life so, in all its misery and mystery, that it was cruel to speak of such experiences as a pleasure. He goes beneath the surface, she said, and he forces himself to look at things from which he would rather turn away. Do you call that amusing yourself? You should see his face sometimes, and he does it for me as much as for himself. He tells me everything. He comes home to me with his trouvailles. We are artists together, and to the artist all things are pure. I've often heard you say so yourself. The novel that Leolin was engaged in at Brighton was never published, but a friend of mine and of Mrs. Stormer's, who was staying there, happened to mention to me later that he had seen the young apprentice to fiction driving, in a dog-cart, a young lady with a very pink face. When I suggested that she was perhaps a woman of title with whom he was conscientiously flirting, my informant replied, She is indeed, but do you know what her title is? He pronounced it. It was familiar and descriptive, but I won't reproduce it here. I don't know whether Leolin mentioned it to his mother. She would have needed all the purity of the artist to forgive him. I hated so to come across him that in the very last years I went rarely to see her, though I knew that she had come pretty well to the end of her rope. I didn't want her to tell me that she had fairly to give her books away. I didn't want to see her cry. She kept it up amazingly, and every few months at my club I saw 3 new volumes in green, in crimson, in blue, on the book table that groaned with light literature. Once I met her at the Academy soirée, where you meet people you thought were dead, and she vouchsafed the information, as if she owed it to me in candour, that Leolin had been obliged to recognize insuperable difficulties in the question of form. He was so fastidious, so that she had now arrived at a definite understanding with him. It was such a comfort, that she would do the form if he would bring home the substance. That was now his position. He foraged for her in the great world at a salary. He's my devil, don't you see? As if I were a great lawyer. He gets up the case, and I argue it. She mentioned further that in addition to his salary, he was paid by the piece. He got so much for a striking character, so much for a pretty name, so much for a plot, so much for an incident, and had so much promised him if he would invent a new crime. He has invented one, I said, and he's paid every day of his life. What is it? She asked, looking hard at the picture of the year, Baby's Tub, near which we happened to be standing. I hesitated a moment. I will write a little story about it, and then you'll see. But she never saw. She had never seen anything, and she passed away with her fine blindness unimpaired. Her son published every scrap of scribbled paper that could be extracted from her table drawers, and his sister quarrelled with him mortally about the proceeds, which showed that she only wanted a pretext, for they cannot have been great. I don't know what Leolin lives upon, unless it be on a queer lady many years older than himself, whom he lately married. The last time I met him, he said to me with his infuriating smile, "Don't you think we can go a little further still? Just a little?" He really goes too far. End of Greville Fane by Henry James.
The Old Virginia by Stewart Edward White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. The ring around the sun had thickened all day long, and the turquoise blue of the Arizona sky had filmed. Storms in the dry countries are infrequent but heavy, and this surely meant storm. We had ridden since sunup over broad mesas, down and out of deep canyons, along the base of the mountains in the wildest parts of the territory. The cattle were winding leisurely toward the high country. The jackrabbits had disappeared, the quail lacked, we did not see a single antelope in the open. "It's a case of hold-up," the cattleman ventured his opinion. "I have a ranch over in the Double R. Charlie and Windy Bill hold it down. We'll tackle it. What do you think?" The 4 cowboys agreed. We dropped into a low, broad watercourse, ascended its bed to big cottonwoods and flowing water, followed it into box canyons between rim rock carved fantastically and painted like a Moorish facade, until at last, in a widening below a rounded hill, we came upon an adobe house, a fruit tree, and a round corral. This was the Double R. Charlie and Windy Bill welcomed us with soda biscuits. We turned our horses out, spread our beds on the floor, filled our pipes, and squatted on our heels. Various dogs of various breeds investigated us. It was very pleasant, and we did not mind the ring around the sun. "Somebody else coming," announced the cattleman finally. "Uncle Jim," said Charlie, after a glance. A hawk-faced old man with a long white beard and long white hair rode out from the cottonwoods. He had on a battered broad hat, abnormally high of crown, carried across his saddle a heavy 8-square rifle, and was followed by a half-dozen lolloping hounds. The largest and fiercest of the latter, catching sight of our group, launched himself with lightning rapidity at the biggest of the ranch dogs, promptly nailed that canine by the back of the neck, shook him violently a score of times, flung him aside, and pounced on the next. During the ensuing few moments, that hound was the busiest thing in the West. He satisfactorily whipped 4 dogs, pursued 2 cats up a tree, upset the Dutch oven and the rest of the soda biscuits, stampeded the horses, and raised a cloud of dust adequate to represent the smoke of battle. We others were too paralyzed to move. Uncle Jim sat placidly on his white horse, his thin knees bent to the oxbow stirrups, smoking. In 10 seconds the trouble was over, principally because there was no more trouble to make. The hound returned leisurely, licking from his chops the hair of his victims. Uncle Jim shook his head. "Trailer," said he sadly, "is a little severe." We agreed heartily and turned in to welcome Uncle Jim with a fresh batch of soda biscuits. The old man was one of the typical longhairs. He had come to the Gailuro Mountains in '69, and since '69 he had remained in the Gailuro Mountains, spite of man or the devil. At present he possessed some hundreds of cattle, which he was reputed to water in a dry season from an ordinary dishpan. In times past he had prospected. That evening, the severe trailer having dropped to slumber, he held forth on big game hunting and dogs, quartz claims and Apaches. "Did you ever have any very close calls?" I asked. He ruminated a few moments, refilled his pipe with some awful tobacco, and told the following experience. "In the time of Geronimo, I was living just about where I do now, and that was just about in line with the raiding. You see, Geronimo and Jew and old Loco used to pile out of the reservation at Camp Apache, raid south to the line, slip over into Mexico when the soldiers got too promiscuous, and raid there until they got ready to come back. Then there was always a big medicine talk," says Geronimo. "I am tired of the warpath. I will come back from Mexico with all my warriors, if you will escort me with soldiers and protect my people." "All right," says the general, being only too glad to get him back at all. So then, in 10 minutes, there wouldn't be a buck in camp, but next morning they shows up again, each with about 50 head of hosses. "Where'd you get those hosses?" asked the general, suspicious. "Had 'em pastured in the hills," answered Geronimo. "I can't take all those hosses with me. I believe they're stolen," says the general. "My people cannot go without their hosses," said Geronimo. So across the line they goes, and back to the reservation. In about a week there's 52 frantic greasers wanting to know where's their hosses. The army is nothing but an importer of stolen stock, and knows it, and can't help it. Well, as I says, I'm between Camp Apache and the Mexican line, so that every raiding party goes right on past me. The point is that I'm 1,000 feet or so above the valley, and the renegades is in such a hurry about that time that they never stop to climb up and collect me. Often I've watched them trailing down the valley in a cloud of dust. Then, in a day or two, a squad of soldiers would come up and camp at my spring for a while. They used to send soldiers to guard every water hole in the country, so the renegades couldn't get water. After a while, from not being bothered none, I got to thinking I wasn't worth while with them. Me and Johnny Hooper were pecking away at the Ole Virginia mine then. We'd got down about 60 feet, all timbered, and was thinking of cross-cutting. One day Johnny went to town, and that same day I got in a hurry and left my gun at camp. I worked all the morning down at the bottom of the shaft, and when I see by the sun it was getting along towards noon, I put in 3 good shots, tamped 'em down, lit the fuses, and started to climb out. It ain't no ways pleasant to light a fuse in a shaft and then have to climb out a 50-foot ladder with it burning behind you. I never did get used to it. You keep thinking, now suppose there's a flaw in that fuse, or something, and she goes off in 6 seconds instead of 2 minutes. Where'll you be then? It would give you a good boost towards your home on high, anyway. So I climbed fast and stuck my head out the top without looking, and then I froze solid enough. There, about 50 feet away, climbing up the hill on mighty tired hosses, was a dozen of the ugliest Chiricahuas you ever don't want to meet, and in addition a Mexican renegade named Maria, who was worse than any of 'em. I see at once their hosses was tired out, and they had a notion of camping at my water hole, not knowing nothing about the Ole Virginia mine. For 2 bits I'd have let go all holts and dropped backwards, trusting to my thick head for easy lighting. Then I heard a little fizz and sputter from below. At that my hair riz right up, so I could feel the breeze blow under my hat. For about 6 seconds I stood there like an imbecile, grinning amiably. Then one of the Chiricahuas made a sort of grunt, and I saved that they'd seen the original exhibit your Uncle Jim was making of himself. Then that fuse gave another sputter, and one of the Apaches said, "Unda." That means white man. It was harder to turn my head than if I'd had a stiff neck, but I managed to do it, and I see that my ore dump wasn't more than 10 feet away. I mighty near overjumped it, and the next I knew I was on one side of it and those Apaches on the other. Probably I flew. Leastways, I don't seem to remember jumping. That didn't seem to do me much good. The renegades were grinning and laughing to think how easy a thing they had, and I couldn't rightly think up any arguments against the notion, at least from their standpoint. They were chattering away to each other in Mexican for the benefit of Maria. Oh, they had me all distributed, down to my suspender buttons, and me squatting behind that ore dump about as formidable as a brush rabbit. Then all at once one of my shots went off down in the shaft. "Boom," says she, "plenty big," and a slather of rocks and stones come out of the mouth, and began to dump promiscuous on the scenery. I got one little one in the shoulder blade, and found time to wish my ore dump had a roof. But those renegades caught it square in the thick of trouble. One got knocked out entirely for a minute by a nice piece of country rock in the head. "Otra vez," yells I, which means again. "Boom," goes the Ole Virginia prompt as an answer. I put in my time dodging, but when I gets a chance to look, the Apaches has all got to cover and is looking scared. "Otra vez," yells I again. "Boom," says the Ole Virginia. This was the biggest shot of the lot, and she surely cut loose. I ought to have been halfway up the hill, watching things from a safe distance. But I wasn't. Lucky for me the shaft was a little on the drift, so she didn't quite shoot my way. But she distributed about a ton over those renegades. They sort of half got to their feet, uncertain. "Otra vez," yells I once more, as bold as if I could keep her shooting all day. It was just a cold, raw blazer, and if it didn't go through, I could see me as an Apache parlor ornament. But it did. Those Chiricahuas gave one yell and skipped. It was surely a funny sight, after they got aboard their war ponies, to see them trying to dig out on horses too tired to trot. I didn't stop to get all the laughs, though. In fact, I give one jump off that ledge, and I lit a running. A quarter hoss couldn't have beat me to that shack. There I grabbed my good old gun, old meat in the pot, and made a climb for the tall country. Uncle Jim stopped with an air of finality and began lazily to refill his pipe. From the open mud fireplace he picked a coal. Outside, the rain, faithful to the prophecy of the wide-ringed sun, beat fitfully against the roof. "That was the closest call I ever had," said he at last. End of The Ole Virginia by Stewart Edward White.
Dave in Love by Steele Rudd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dave in Love. Ploughing and sowing all over, 100 acres of the plainland under wheat, and light showers falling every week. Dad's good luck was continuing. Yet we were sharing other misfortunes freely enough. The children were all down with measles, Sarah with faceache, Joe with a broken rib. A draught horse broke it for him. Joe had sandy blight and one morning approached the wrong end of a horse with the winkers. And Dave was the victim of a fatal malady. Dave was always the unlucky one. When he wasn't bitten by a snake or a dog, he was gored by a cow or something. This time it was a woman. Dave was in love, and such love, we could see it working in him like yeast. He became affable, smiled all day long, and displayed remarkable activity. He didn't care how hard he worked or whose work he performed. He did anything, everything, and without help. He developed a passion for small things, trifles he had hitherto regarded with contempt, purchased silk handkerchiefs and perfume and conversation lollies at the store, and secreted them in the pockets of his Sunday coat, which he left hanging in his room. Sarah would find them when dusting the coat and hawk them to Mother, and they'd spend an hour rejoicing and speculating over the discovery. Sarah never allowed any dust to settle on Dave's Sunday coat. Dave went out every night. It amused Joe. He would be on pins and needles till supper was ready. Then he'd bolt his food and rush off to saddle a horse, and we wouldn't see him again till breakfast time next morning. For more than a year, Dave rushed off every night. "Dare me look at that horse," Dad used to say when he'd be at the yard. Then he'd think hard and begin again when he met Mother. "This night work'll have to stop, or there won't be a horse about the place fit to ride. What the devil the fellow wants chasing round the country for every night, I don't know, I'm sure." Dad knew well enough. "Well," Mother would say good-naturedly, "you were just as bad yourself once, Father." "Never, woman," with virtuous indignation. "I never left a horse hanging to a fence night after night to starve." But there the matter always ended, and Dave continued his courting without interruption. It was Fanny Bowman of Ranger's Rise Dave was after. She was 20, dark, fresh-complexioned, robust and rosy, a good rider, good cook, and a most enterprising flirt. Tom Black, Tom Bell, Joe Sibley and Jim Moore all had sought her affections unsuccessfully. And young Cowley climbed into a loft one night and would have hanged himself with the dog chain because of her inconstancy, only a curlew screeched so awfully sudden just outside the door that he rushed out and fell down 16 steps and injured himself internally. Fanny Bowman was a dairymaid, mostly neat and natty and nice, but there were times when she didn't look so nice. She had frequently to go into the yard and milk 15 and 20 cows before breakfast, and a glimpse at her then, especially in wet weather, with a man's hat on, her skirts gathered round her waist, barefooted, slush over her ankles, slush on her arms and smeared on her face, wasn't calculated to quicken a fellow's pulse. But then it wasn't at such times that Dave passed judgment on her, any more than the city swell would judge his Hetty while her hair was on the dresser and her teeth in a basin. Some Sundays Dave used to bring Fanny to spend the afternoon at our place, and Jack Gore very often came with them. Jack Gore was Bowman's man, a superior young fellow, so Bowman boasted, one that could always be depended upon. He took his meals with the family and shared the society of their friends, went to church with them, worked his own horse in their plough, and was looked upon as one of the family. Dave didn't look upon him as one of the family, though. He was the fly in Dave's ointment. Dave hated him like poison. When it was time to leave, Dave had almost to break his neck to reach Fanny's side in time to lift her into the saddle. If he were a moment late, Gore would lift her. If he were slow at all in mounting his horse, Gore would coolly ride off with Fanny. If he didn't happen to be slow in mounting, Gore would ride on the near side of her and monopolise the conversation. He monopolised it in any case. Mother and Sarah used to talk about Jack Gore. "If I were Dave," Sarah would say, "I'm blessed if I'd have her carrying on with him the way she does." "But Fanny only means it as a sister," Mother would say in palliation. "Does she indeed? Dave's an old fool to bother about her at all, if you ask me." Sarah was developing a keen interest. Jack Gore left Bowman's service one morning. He left it suddenly. Bowman sacked him, and Mrs. Bowman talked to the neighbours about him with the wrath of an insulted mother. "The cheek of him," she said to Mother, "to think he was good enough for Fanny. Why, we wouldn't have kept him a day if we'd thought, if we'd ever dreamt. Fanny, indeed." But she spoke highly of Dave. She moved Mother to tears of admiration for him, and Mother couldn't resist telling Dave all that was said. Dave went to Bowman's a little earlier that night, but returned quite unexpectedly and went to bed in a bad humour. A change came over Dave. He ceased to smile and scarcely did any work, and never brought Fanny to see us on Sundays. At last Dave met Fanny on her way to the railway station one day, and when he came home he went straight to the album and took out her photo and jumped on it. Jack Gore had been away from Saddletop for several months when, "Girls are more of a trouble than boys," Mrs. Bowman said despondingly to Mother one evening at the gate. "Boys is nothing. They can always take care of theirselves. But girls—" and she shook her head. Jack Gore returned to Bowman's one day, and neither Bowman nor Mrs. Bowman attempted to chase him away. Work was suspended for 24 hours, and at midday a tired, dust-covered parson came to their door astride a poor horse, and got down and married Jack Gore to Fanny. It was a quiet wedding. When they heard of it, Mother and Sarah whispered things to one another, and Dad thought of Dave. "Thank God," he said. "The horses will have a chance to get fat now." End of Dave in Love by Steele Rudd.